Sounds great. Morning. Morning.
You're the teacher.
I am.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm a
Good morning. Happy Wednesday. As you can hear, my voice is still not 100%. Again, my new book is up on the screen if anyone's interested in doing that, being released serially. I just saw yesterday they released chapter 3, so the information is up there for you. Nothing I'm covering in this class is in this book, so it's totally different. But we are on day 3 of the study of the temple and temple theology through Scripture. Today's gonna be a little different because days 1 and 2, I was really laying the foundation, as one does with a temple, of theology. So you understand what a temple is, how the temple in Israel was constructed, all the different elements and symbols of them. Today we're gonna get into more stories from the Old Testament about how the temple functioned and, frankly, how people abused it. So to begin, I wanna tell a joke. It's not my joke. I think Tony Campolo came up with this joke. He said there's 2 kinds of Christians. There's dog Christians and there's cat Christians. Have you guys heard this? I apologize in advance to cat lovers. There's dog Christians and there's cat Christians. He said dog Christians say, you love me, you feed me, you care for me, you must be God. And cat Christians say, you love me, you feed me, you care for me, I must be God. And that sort of summarizes what we're gonna cover today. There's one attitude that says God came to dwell with the people of Israel. He called them to be his priests, to be his special representatives upon the earth, to minister between him and the rest of the world. And some Israelites looked at that special calling and were like, wow, you must be God, that you would pick us, these weak nobodies, to represent you in the world. But then there are other Israelites who go, wait a minute, God chose us. We must be really special. We must be better than everybody else. We must have a license to do whatever we want because God is on our side. That breakdown of attitude is the difference between humility and arrogance. And you still see it in the church today. And we'll get into that. So today what we're covering in part 3 is empire and arrogance. Let's retrace the history a little bit that we've been through so far. We saw in Genesis, the opening chapters, that the creation narrative in Genesis 1 was really about God building his temple. And the entire universe is his temple, the place where he dwells. And then he puts his image, his idol, into this temple, which is humanity, male and female created in his image. But then you get to Genesis chapter 2, and despite the entire world being his temple, he chooses one particular piece of land to make his presence especially known, which is Eden. We looked at all the ways in which Eden is actually a temple metaphor. And he calls Adam and Eve to care for and work the garden, serve and protect. These are verbs only associated with priestly responsibilities. And in Genesis 3, the man and the woman tell God, nope, we don't want to be your priests. We don't want to care for your temple. We don't want to represent you. We want to be God instead. And so they're cast out of the temple and sent east into the wilderness. And through the story of Genesis, people keep going east, 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 further and further and further away from God's presence, until he calls Abraham from the east to the west. And he says to Abraham, okay, I'm gonna start over. And through you and your descendants, I'm gonna try this again. We're gonna make another Eden, another temple space where I can dwell with my people. And there's gonna be another priesthood, and these priests are gonna represent me once again. And unlike Adam and Eve, I'm calling you to be faithful to this vocation. So fast forward 400 years, God's people are slaves in Egypt. Through Moses, he rescues them, and they go to Mount Sinai in the desert. And he gives them detailed instructions for the construction of a new temple, a tabernacle, a mobile temple. And just like Genesis 1 was a 7-day structure of how God built his temple, In Exodus, we are given 7 speeches that Moses receives 7 chunks of instruction from God, which he then presents to the people. And one of the consistent themes of Exodus is that it's God himself who builds his temple. Remember, he made provision for all the supplies that they would need. They plundered the Egyptians with the gold and fabrics and all the instruments they would need for the temple. And then he fills people with his spirit so that they have the skills and knowledge in order to build this temple. So over and over and over, what you hear in Exodus is it's God who designed it, he provided for it, he built it. It's all God who does this work. And at the very end of Exodus, God's presence comes and fills the temple in the form of fire from heaven. And I hope you got this by now. The most essential element of any temple is what? God's presence. Okay, so that's where we left off yesterday. I want to pick up the story about 400 years after that. So for 4 centuries, the Israelites have had this mobile tabernacle. And it's the place where they've gone to meet with God. And the descendants of Aaron have been the priests who have worked and kept this temple. By the time of David, roughly, this tabernacle is set up in a place called Shiloh. Shiloh is about 20 some miles north of modern day Jerusalem. If you know anything about the geography of the area, that's where it was. I want you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2. So by this time, the descendants of Aaron are Eli, who's the high priest, and his sons. They're the ones in charge of the tabernacle. I'm going to start reading in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12. I love how the scripture gets right to the point. Eli's sons were scoundrels. They had no regard for the Lord. Now, it was the practice of the priest that whenever any of the people offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged fork in his hand while the meat was being boiled, and would plunge the fork into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. Whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is how they treated all the Israelites who came to Shiloh. But even before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the person who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some of the meat to roast. He won't accept boiled meat from you, but only raw." If the person said to him, "Let the fat be burned first, and then take whatever you want," the servant would answer, "No, hand it over now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." This sin of the young men was very great in the Lord's sight, and they were treating the Lord's offering with contempt. Jump down to verse 22. Now Eli, the high priest, who was very old, heard about everything his sons were doing to all the Israelites and how they slept with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting is the tabernacle. It's the temple. So he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear from all the people about these wicked deeds of yours. Now, my sons, the report I hear spreading among the Lord's people is not good. If one person sins against another, God may mediate for the offender. But if anyone sins against the Lord, who will intercede for them?" His sons, however, did not listen to their father's rebuke, for it was the Lord's will to put them to death. Okay, things are not going well at the temple tabernacle. Let's unpack this a little bit. Eli's sons, the priests, remember the priests and the high priest especially, we talked about this yesterday. The high priest wore a breastplate that had all the stones, 12 stones with the 12 tribes engraved on them, meaning the high priest bore the names of Israel on himself. And on his forehead, he bore the name of the Lord. And the whole idea was The priest represents the people before the Lord, and he represents the Lord before the people. That was Eli's responsibility, but he shared that responsibility with the whole priesthood, including his own children. But they had a very different attitude about their role. Rather than serving the Lord or serving the people, they used their priestly role to serve themselves. Let me unpack 3 problems here that I think relate, frankly, to what we see in a lot of the American church. The first problem, and by the way, we're talking about arrogant priests. The first problem is just arrogance. Rather than viewing their priestly calling with humility, they arrogantly believed that their priestly calling elevated them above other people, and that they were guardians of God's house, and he had chosen them to bear his holy name and to be a bridge between humanity and divinity, between the heavens and the earth. And they did indeed have a special calling. But there's a difference between having a special calling and being a special person. That's how piety turns into pride. Because I have a special role, I must be a special person. Now, for those of you who've got some Bible knowledge, there's a lot of amazing stories in Scripture of God using remarkable people to do his work in the world. We've talked about Moses yesterday, Abraham, David. Can you think of some rather unremarkable things or people that God has used to accomplish his purposes? Balaam's donkey. Yeah. Dave Johnson, who's spoken here before, is pastor of Church of the Open Door up in Minneapolis, used to say that in the Old Testament, it was a miracle when God spoke through an ass, but now he does it every Sunday. Balaam's donkey is a great example. What else? What's that? Rahab, a prostitute, the original pretty woman, the hooker with a heart of gold. All the disciples. Okay. Paul. Yeah, Paul murdered Christians. He uses frogs. He uses grasshoppers. He uses all kinds of things. Simply being used by God is not evidence of God's blessing. This is a huge mistake we make all the time in the church today. We think because somebody has a quote unquote effective ministry, because they have a big church, because thousands have come to faith through their preaching, we then make the assumption that just because God is using that person, and he very well may be, just because God is using that person does not mean God is blessing that person, or that everything that person does is somehow in line with God's will. God was still using Eli and his scandalous sons as priests, and yet he'd marked them for death. Don't fall into the trap of believing effectiveness is the same as faithfulness. It's not. So their first problem is they thought that their special calling made them special people, and therefore they could act however they wanted, that they had special privileges. Dallas Willard, who's a huge influence on me, spoke here many years ago, has since passed away. He said this, and it's haunted me ever since I heard it. He said the greatest threat to devotion to Christ is service for Christ. The greatest threat to devotion to Christ is service for Christ. What does he mean? When you're in a ministry role, you can equate your ministry role with your relationship with God. They're not the same thing. So because they had a ministry role, Eli's son said, we're good with God. What's he gonna do? We're the priests. Of course, we have this special calling. And so they didn't bother to examine themselves and their terrible behavior. Here's the second problem. Not only were they arrogant, they were also unaccountable. There was an authority above Eli's sons, an authority that was supposed to hold them to account for their behavior. That authority was Eli. He was the high priest. As we say in politics, the buck stopped with him. And he goes to them and says, hey guys, kids, sons, what you're doing is not good. And they're like, shut up, Dad. And Dad goes, okay. He just wanders off. He confronted them, but he didn't do anything. So Eli was complicit in the evil of his children because he did nothing to stop them when it was his responsibility to do so. In chapter 3, it goes on to say that Eli was well aware of his son's behavior, but, quote, he failed to restrain them. And we're not talking about children here. His sons are grown men. But he did nothing to restrain them. How does this relate to where we are today in the American church? There's always going to be people in positions of ministry authority who abuse their positions. And that's tragic enough. But what makes it worse is when the accountability structures are in place, don't exercise their authority to hold those leaders responsible. And frankly, in some of our churches, there is no accountability structure, which is a huge problem. The problem we see in the American church today is not just sinful, broken, arrogant leaders in some places. It's the failure of the authorities above them to hold them accountable. And then you got to ask the third question, why? Why aren't they holding those leaders accountable? And that gets to our third point. I think Eli and his sons had fallen into the trap of believing in their own perpetuity. Let me explain what I mean by that. The first high priest was Aaron, Moses' brother. And all the priests since then for 400 years have been descendants of Aaron. And now, of course, it's Eli and his sons. And they just assumed, of course, the priestly line must continue through the line of Aaron. It has to be our family. No one else can do this. God has ordained it. It's Aaron's line that is supposed to be the priesthood forever. So they thought their position in this mediating role was untouchable. Because if someone stopped them, there would be no priesthood. How would the work of the temple ever get done? How would the sacrifices be offered? How would God be mediated to the people? It had to be them. I think this is why Eli didn't restrain his sons, because he thought, who else is going to do it? If I kick them out, if I remove them from ministering at the temple, there's no one else qualified to do this work. How will the mission and ministry of the Lord go on? I guess it has to be these horrible, greedy, sexually immoral men must be the ones to keep doing it because there's nobody else. Again, we see this in the American church. We don't have to dive into specific scandals, but this is the pattern I have seen over and over again. Immorality is uncovered. The accountability structure is aware of this immorality, but they don't intervene, they don't restrain, they don't remove the person. Why? Well, it would hurt the ministry. The ministry must go on. No one preaches like that guy. How are we going to keep the payroll going if we kick him out? Our payroll is $500,000 a month. Not Okoboji. I actually talked to a church that was in the midst of a scandal, and their payroll was $500,000 a month. And that payroll was dependent on people coming in and filling seats and putting money in plates, and they were coming to hear the golden-tongued speaker who was engaged in all kinds of sexual immorality that they had to cover up in order to make sure that everyone still got paid. How will the ministry continue if we remove the leaders even though they're immoral? So, they're on an extended sabbatical. They're just going to take a break. They're going to be restored to ministry in 30 days, no problem. We use all kinds of justifications because we believe in this ministry of perpetuity. Who built the temple? Not Eli, not Aaron, not Moses, not Eli's sons. Who's building the church? God. Not your pastor, not your denomination, not your minister, not your favorite Christian celebrity. Jesus Christ is building his church. He does not need the help of immoral men and women. And when we tolerate that, what we're confessing is we don't think God can do it without our help. That is the height of arrogance. And yes, here's what will happen. If you remove immoral leaders, churches may close their doors. Ministries may shutter. Christian camps may no longer minister to children. They also won't be abusing those children. Yes, bad things will happen. But we believe in a God who brings redemption out of darkness and who builds things that have died. Don't fall into the trap of Eli and his sons of tolerating immorality simply because the ministry must go on. Okay. What's interesting about this story, there's that old saying that the fish rots from the head down. You heard that? You see the corruption of the priesthood in 1 Samuel chapter 2. By the time you get to 1 Samuel chapter 4, you see how this rotten view, this entitled cat-like view of God trickles down from the priesthood to all the people. So let's go there. We talked about the arrogant priests. Let's talk about the arrogant people. During the Civil War, a journalist asked President Lincoln if he believed that God was on the side of the North. And Lincoln responded, "Sir, my great concern is not whether God is on our side. My greatest concern is to be on God's side, for God is always right." It's a very humble answer. When you have a cat Christian mentality, you feed me, you love me, you care for me, I must be God, it can very quickly slip into, of course God is on my side, no matter what I do. I'm his chosen servant, or we are his chosen people. Lincoln didn't have that posture. What you see in 1 Samuel chapter 4 is the Israelites adopting the arrogant posture of course God is on our side. We're his chosen people. So let's look at the story. 1 Samuel 4 verse 1. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped near Ebenezer and the Philistines near Aphek. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. Not a good day for Israel. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, from the tabernacle, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. Remember yesterday we looked at the ark and the cherubim on the lid? And Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." All right, let me stop there. The Israelites have a battle, it doesn't go well, and their thinking is, we need reinforcements. We need God, the literal presence of God, to go before us. And when the ark comes in, they're thrilled. They are so excited because this ark, remember yesterday we talked about it, represented the footstool of God's throne. And anyone who touches the ark dies. This is a crazy power. And so with confidence, they carry this ark with them into battle before their enemies. The Israelites wielded God's presence as a weapon against their enemies because they assume my enemies must be the same as God's enemies. If I hate them, God must hate them. If they're against me, they must be against God. See the cat thing going on there? Do you see any parallels to what we do today? We have some perceived enemy. Could be a person, a group, an issue. And we think, surely God agrees with me. I am going to use God as a weapon against the things that I believe are wrong. And we don't even do much reflection and ask, are you sure God agrees with you? We just automatically assume, of course he does. Don't you know who I am? I am an evangelical. I am a church-going Christian. I believe in the authority of the scriptures. I hold to a traditional Christian ethic of marriage. Of course God agrees with me. Of course he's on my side. Look at all the things he's done. I am going to use God as a weapon against my cultural, political, even familial enemies, quote verses at them, shout at them, tell them God's gonna condemn them. I'm gonna put the presence of God in their face, and they're gonna know who's on my side. And we will have the victory. Interestingly, there's a worship song, we may have sung it this week, I'm not sure. There's a worship song that's very popular that actually echoes this chapter. And it also echoes the New Testament, but it's a really interesting, almost Rorschach test of a worship song. Because I think it's beautiful and true and accurate depending on how you understand it. And if our God is for us, who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could ever stand against? It's true. But there's one critical word in that worship song. If. If our God is with us. If he stands with us. We don't take much time to reflect on that part, do we? Are you sure he's on your side? Are you sure you're right about everything? To the point where you are willing to put the name of God out in front in your cultural battle? Remember yesterday, again, the priest has the name of God on his forehead? And the commandment, you shall not bear my name in vain. Do not apply my name to something that is not consistent with my character. When we bear the name of Jesus and demonize and mistreat people made in his image, we are violating the second commandment. It's a very dangerous thing to employ the name of God casually in our battles. And we see what happens to the Israelites. Verse 10. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons died. How is that possible? The ark of God, the people celebrating that he's gonna have the victory for them, and God just goes, I didn't sign up for this. This ain't my battle. What's the problem here? Go back to Abraham Lincoln. Is God on the side of the North? I don't know. My goal is not for God to be on my side. My goal is to be on God's side. The Israelites' attitude was, no, he's on our side, always. And God said, I'm not a tool to be used by you. You don't wield me, I wield you. This is the arrogance that came from Eli and his sons, who were using the temple and the tabernacle for their own enrichment, their own gratification, their own abuse. And the people picked up on that and go, well, the priests use God that way, we're gonna use God that way too. He's gonna make Israel great again. He's gonna defeat our enemies for us. And God very loudly says, I'm not playing your games. Let me pause there and just ask what questions you have about these 2 stories of either ungodly, arrogant leadership or ungodly, arrogant people employing God's presence and name.
It sounds like they're worshiping the ark rather than God.
He said it sounds like they're worshiping the ark rather than God. Maybe, yeah. It's certainly not humble worship, is it? It's utilitarian worship. We are going to worship God to get the outcome we want. We're in charge. You love me, you feed me, you care for me. We must be God. Other questions? Yeah.
Many churches, if the people rise up to get rid of the pastor, what we find out is the hierarchy of the church favors the pastor.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the pastor that may be morally incorrect is protected by the hierarchy of the church, and they're allowed to leave without the criticism of the people that are trying to fire them. So some other church can fire them right away. It's deep in this country.
Yeah.
And it happens in many churches.
It does. I'm not here to litigate what church structures are best or worst, because they all have their shortcomings. But I will say this. If you find yourself in a role of church leadership, whether as a pastor, as a staff person, as a lay leader, as an elder, whatever your role might be, I think the bare essential requirement for leadership in the church of any of these roles is that a person fears God more than they fear people. And if we simply allowed that to guide us, I think we would avoid a lot of the problems that we see. It sounds overly simplistic, and in some ways it is. But if we believe that God is the one building his church, not us, if we believe that a ministry can close or a church can end and it's not the end of the mission of God, if it's not on our shoulders, then we are freed up to make decisions that honor God rather than fear people. Some systems are better at that than others, but it's a whole different thing. Any other questions about these two stories? Yeah, way in the back.
In the New Testament, is it the equivalent of Lord, Lord, have we not?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. In the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, Jesus talks about the day of judgment. And he says, many will come to me on that day and say, Lord, Lord, did we not cast out demons, perform miracles, and do many mighty works? Or did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons, and do many mighty works? When you break down what those three statements mean, it's really interesting. Now, Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount is speaking to a Jewish audience. And in this story, he puts himself in the place of the judge on the day of judgment. Who did Jews believe was the judge on the day of judgment? God. So this is Jesus declaring himself to be God. And the people in the story say to him, Lord, Lord, meaning you are the rightful judge. These are people who believe that Jesus is God. And then they say, did we not prophesy in your name? That means they preached in the name of Jesus. They said, we cast out demons in your name. You can take that literally, figuratively, I don't care. We're talking about people who fought against evil in the world. And then they said they did mighty works. The Greek word there is the same word for dynamite. Explosive, powerful, spectacular miracles. So they have good theology. They believe in the divinity of Jesus. These are ministers. They're preaching in God's name, Jesus' name. They're fighting evil, and they're actually performing miracles. This is how they've spent their life. And Jesus says, I will say to them, away from me, I never knew you. What? There's a word he uses there to describe them. He calls them workers of lawlessness. What that word means is these are people who did not submit to an authority other than their own. This is exactly right. Their error was they used God, and people thought they were serving God, but they were actually using God to achieve what they wanted, rather than submitting to Jesus and doing what he wanted. And the scary, I've taught on this before here. Sorry for those of you bored by old content, but I think that passage in Matthew 7, as a minister, is the most frightening passage in the Bible. And the most frightening word in that passage is the word many. Many will go into eternity completely convinced they belong to Jesus because they've spent their life in ministry for him. And we'll find out at the end, I never knew you. And the obvious question that comes out of this is, wait a minute, time out, Skye. If they didn't belong to Jesus, how did they cast out demons and do miracles? Again, effectiveness is not the same as faithfulness. Just because God uses you does not mean you belong to him. Preston yesterday talked about how God used Nebuchadnezzar. God used the Assyrians. God used the Babylonians. He also judged them because they were terrible, idolatrous, evil empires. But he still used them. Being used by God is not evidence that you belong to him. This is the error we make over and over and over again, especially in the American church where we are so enamored with results and outcomes. Big ministry, huge impact. Great, God may be doing something genuinely amazing, but don't assume that the leaders at the center of it are godly. They may be, I hope they are, But outcomes are not a reflection of faithfulness. It's not the fruit that we're called to look at. I'm on a tangent now. Matthew 7, where that passage is about the judgment, right before it, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about you will know a tree by its fruit. A good tree bears good fruit, a bad tree bears bad fruit. And he calls us to discern true prophets and false prophets by their fruit. What's the fruit he's talking about? It can't be miracles. It can't be driving out demons. It can't be powerful preaching, because that's the stuff he just dismisses 3 verses later. What's the fruit? Character. Character. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, self-control. Do they reflect the character of God? It's a real old cliche. Character counts. Character doesn't just count. Character is everything. Okay. Let's go on to the next story. For this one, we got to go to 2 Samuel chapter 6. And I'm probably not going to take as much time on this story as I would like, because we got to get to the fun stuff with Solomon's temple. We talked about arrogant priests, arrogant people. Let's talk about arrogant worship. So let me give you the background. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, just before, obviously, chapter 6, David has had a string of amazing blessings. He is finally installed officially as king over Israel. Remember, he's had this battle with Saul for a long time. He's finally recognized as the legitimate king. Second, he conquers Jerusalem. And he decides to make Jerusalem his new capital for his kingdom. Third, he defeats the Philistines, this chronic enemy of Israel. So it's all like rainbows and sunshine for David in chapter 5. He becomes king, new capital, defeats his worst enemies. So in chapter 6, David decides, I want to honor God, who's given me all these blessings. And so he wants to move the ark from where it's been. I think it's been in Shiloh still up to this point. He wants to bring the ark into his new capital, into Jerusalem. So look at chapter 6, 2 Samuel 6. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. And he and all his men went to it's not Shiloh, it's Belial, in Judea, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord God Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it. And Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all of Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. Imagine a worship procession with 30,000 people. I mean, this is pretty impressive. Anyone notice a problem? What's the problem? There's no priests. And where's the ark? It's on a cart being pulled by oxen. Back in Exodus, God gave very specific instructions. We didn't cover this yesterday. The ark was only ever supposed to be moved on the shoulders of priests with those poles. Because remember, you can't touch the ark. If you touch the ark, like if you touch the mountain, you'll die. So by putting these long poles on either side of the ark through these loops, they could then lift the ark on the shoulders of priests. And if the ground is uneven, it's easier to maneuver that when you're walking with 4 priests carrying the ark on their shoulders. David and the others here decide, that's too much work. That's too difficult. I'm sweating up here, so I'm gonna put my hat on so you guys don't get blinded by my perspiration. They decide, that's too much work. We're just gonna put the ark on a cart. It's a nice cart, it's brand new, right? It's not like some sleazy used cart that we got at the used cart mart down the ways, right? It's a really nice cart. And we're gonna pull it with oxen, disregarding what God had commanded. Let me pause here because I think in an interesting way this illustrates an approach, again, many of us take in our worship. Our worship is inspired often by all the blessings that we have received from God. Just like David, he'd received in chapter 5 all these amazing blessings. And therefore we primarily view God as the one who blesses us. And so in response to all the goodness of God and his blessings, maybe filled with genuine gratitude, our worship can be casual, flippant, irreverent. Because he's just the God who does great things. He's the God who's on my side. He's the God who made me king and defeats my enemies, gives me a new capital. Yeah, he's that God. He's a great God. He likes me. I don't have to worry about him. He's cool with me. That's kind of David's attitude. And it comes back to bite him. Verse 6, when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down and he died there beside the ark of God. Whose fault was Uzzah's death? David's. It was David's fault. Because rather than obeying the command of God and reverently, humbly carrying the ark the way God instructed, he took the easy route. This is what I mean by arrogant worship. God's cool. He doesn't care. He's fine. You know, he's just my buddy. We put him on t-shirts and bumper stickers. He's good with that. He doesn't mind when we, put him out in front in our political battles with each other. He doesn't mind when we employ his name to fight against our cultural enemies and tell people that God hates them, even though they're made in his image. He's cool when I do that all the time. He doesn't mind. These stories should scare the living daylights out of you. That's what they're meant to do. I do not want to be one of those people on the day of judgment that Jesus says, I never knew you. You used me and my name all the time, but I never actually knew you. You sang hymns and songs to me all the time, but you were just using me to achieve your own dreams and desires. You weren't actually submitting to me. What's interesting is after Uzzah died, David stops the worship service right there. He's like, okay, hold on, time out. What is up with this God? He's supposed to be on my side and he went and killed my friend. Verse 8, David was angry because of the Lord's wrath. Verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day. He's angry and he's afraid. His vision of God changes dramatically from God's on my side, God's gonna bless me, I can't do anything wrong, everything I do is win, 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 because God's with me, to all of a sudden, whoa, I don't get this God anymore. I'm scared, I'm angry. So he says, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? And David was unwilling to bring the ark of the Lord with him into the city of David. And instead, he leaves it right there at the home of this Gittite. Now, what goes on in the story, we won't unpack all the details, is after a couple of months, as David has time to reflect on all of this, He realizes, no, you know what? I do want the presence of God with me in Jerusalem. And he decides, let's try again. Let's bring the ark all the way in this time. But he does it a little differently. If you look at verse 12, so David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord, notice, how's the ark being moved? It's being carried now. You learned that lesson. When those carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. The language is a little muddled here in our English translations. It's not that they took 6 steps and then he sacrificed an animal. More accurately, every 6 steps, they sacrificed an animal. David came to understand that true worship of God is to be a reflection of God's character. And yes, he is the God who blesses. He is the God who fights our battles. He is the God who gives us good things. He had that vision at the beginning of the chapter, but he's also the God who is dangerous, a consuming fire, who's holy and beyond our ability to fully comprehend and understand. He is a God of reverence and awe. And so now David's worship is both full of rejoicing. He's still singing, he's still dancing, there's still music, but it's also full of reverence. The ark is being carried and there's sacrifice. You see the difference? Some of our Christian traditions are real heavy on the reverence part. You go in some of those churches and it's like, whew, this is weird. It's different. I don't get all the symbols. I don't get all the smoke. I don't get all the icons. I don't get all that. And some of our churches are real big on the rejoicing. People are celebrating and there's hands up and they're singing all that. And they're both accurate reflections of some aspect of God. But where's the combination? Where's the acknowledgement that God is, yes, both the one who blesses and the one before whom we fall in silence and express reverence? Okay, I want to move on to the final bit, which is going to take a little bit of time. Arrogant ministry. 1 Kings 5-8. We're not going to cover all those chapters, but this section is about the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. If you remember your Bible teaching, when David brings the ark into Jerusalem, he decides, you know what? For 400 years, God has been living in a tent. The tabernacle is just a temporary tent that can be moved around. And David says to himself, I live in a palace made of stone. But God, who made me king, is living in a tent. That ain't right. I'm gonna build a palace for God. I'm gonna build a stone temple here in Jerusalem for God. And God says, thanks, appreciate the gesture, but no thanks. I don't want a temple. Look at, this is back a little bit. This is 2 Samuel 7. The Lord speaking to David says, I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to you, why have you not built me a house of cedar? In other words, God is saying, I don't want a temple, a permanent temple. I am perfectly content residing in this tabernacle. And he says to David, instead of you building me a house, I'm gonna build you a house. And he means this metaphorically. And he says to David, one of your descendants will always be on the throne. There will be the house of David, the dynasty of David, which which of course ultimately leads to Jesus. But David doesn't quite shake this idea that it would be good for God to actually have a permanent temple in Jerusalem. So after David dies, Solomon, his son, becomes king. And most people, from Sunday school or whatever, remember Solomon for just a handful of reasons. What are some of the things you remember about Solomon? He's wise, rich. He had a ton of wives, which makes me wonder how he stayed rich. What else? Peace. Fell away. Fell away from the faith. What's he most remembered for doing? He builds the temple. That's why it's called Solomon's temple. It's not a temple where Solomon lives. It's a temple that Solomon built where God lives, right? What's interesting though is when you actually get into the stories about Solomon and the text about Solomon, yeah, we hear all this stuff about his wisdom. The biblical writers have a much more ambivalent view of Solomon. I would argue the Bible, for the most part, like, have you ever seen these charts that have like the good kings of Israel and then the bad kings of Israel? Where is Solomon? He's almost always listed in the good column. I disagree. I think he was actually one of the worst. And I think that's what the text wants us to get, but it's kind of subtle. So let me kind of begin to draw that out for you. Remember yesterday we talked about in Exodus, there's 15 chapters of Exodus. The last 15 chapters of that book are all about the tabernacle and God giving the detailed instructions of how things are to be designed and all the different furnishings and all the embroidery and all the dimensions. Every last detail was given by God to Moses, who then carried those instructions down to the people. And then all of the materials to build the tabernacle were provided by God through the Egyptians to the Israelites. A detail we did not cover yesterday, which is too bad because it's really interesting, is Moses, again based on God's instructions, invited the Israelites to voluntarily contribute all the materials that they had plundered from Egypt for the construction of the temple. Meaning, Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew would go back to their tent at night and they'd look around at all the loot that they had stolen from Egypt, and they'd say, we should probably give some more of this tomorrow morning to the temple or the tabernacle construction project. Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew go, okay, yeah, they put aside some of the gold and some of the fabric and clothing and stuff. And the next morning they go out and they give it to Moses and Aaron. They go, hey, here's some more stuff to build the tabernacle. And they receive it gratefully. And then that night they go back to their tent and Mr. and Mrs. Hebrew look around again and they go, you know what? We don't need all this stuff. There's actually more that we could give. And the next day they come and they contribute even more. This goes on over and over and over again in the book of Exodus, to the point where the workers tell Moses, you need to get the people to stop giving us so much stuff. We have too much. Because the generosity of God's people just kept. Have you ever been in churches that use these stories to like new building project kind of stuff, right? But they're actually beautiful stories because it's not coerced, it's not forced. People willingly, generously contribute. Why? Because they didn't earn any of that stuff. It had been given to them freely when they plundered the Egyptians. So in the book of Exodus, the entire construction of the tabernacle, every facet of it, was driven by the Lord. Design, the materials, the Spirit filling the workers in order to inspire them to how to do all of it. But when you get to Solomon's temple, when you get to 1 Kings, in these chapters about the construction of Solomon's temple, the interesting thing is it draws almost exact quotes from Exodus. In some cases, there are exact quotes. The Hebrew is lifted directly from Exodus and put in here in 1 Kings chapters 5 through 8 as it's describing the design and construction of the temple in Jerusalem. But there is one huge, huge difference. God and his Spirit are not involved in any way. God does not initiate the idea of building the temple. He said, I don't want it. Remember? God does not provide the instructions. The dimensions, the blueprints don't come from God. God does not supply the materials for the temple in Jerusalem. God's Spirit does not empower the workers to build it. God does not supervise the project. He's almost entirely absent from these chapters, even though they quote directly from the tabernacle construction back in Exodus. Instead, all of the credit for building the temple, instead of going to God, who does it go to? Solomon. It was Solomon's idea. It was Solomon's design. Solomon was the general contractor. He oversaw all of it in great detail. Let me draw out one example of this that illustrates the difference. Remember yesterday, we talked about how in Exodus 35, God singled out one man named Bezalel to lead the effort to build the tabernacle. Exodus 35 says, see, Yahweh has chosen Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur of the tribe of Judah, and he was filled with the Spirit of God, with wisdom, with understanding, with knowledge, and with all kinds of skills. So God chose Bezalel, fills him with the Holy Spirit, the first person anywhere in Scripture since Genesis who's described as being filled with the Spirit of God, and he's empowered by God's Spirit to oversee the construction of the tabernacle. That was Exodus. The exact same language is used to describe the man that Solomon chooses to oversee the construction of his temple. This guy's name is Huram, Huram. This is 1 Kings 7, verse 14. And it says, Huram was filled with wisdom, with understanding, and with knowledge to do all kinds of work. Exactly the same words from Exodus, with one significant difference. Huram was not filled with the Spirit of God. In fact, Huram was not even an Israelite. He was a Canaanite. He was a pagan. He was an idol worshiper. Why did Solomon choose a foreigner, a Canaanite, someone who doesn't even worship the God whose temple he's building? Because he's a good worker. This is from top to bottom Solomon's plan and project, not God's. And that's what the writer of 1 Kings is trying to get us to understand. If you're an ancient Israelite and you've marinated in these scriptures your whole life, you know intimately the story of the construction of the tabernacle from Exodus. And when you hear the exact same language here, you'd be like, oh yeah, God did that before. But it's a Canaanite? And God's not involved? And he's not filled with God's Spirit? What would the message be? This is not part of God's plan. This is about Solomon. I'll give you some more examples. In 1 Kings chapter 6, I'm going to just rattle off a bunch of verses and quote them. And notice in Exodus, it's Yahweh did this and Yahweh did that and the Lord this and God that. Here's 1 Kings 6, verse 2. The temple that King Solomon built for Yahweh was 6 cubits long. Verse 4, he, Solomon, made narrow windows high up in the temple walls. Verse 15, Solomon lined its interior walls with cedar boards. Verse 29, on the walls all around the temple, Solomon carved cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. There are dozens and dozens of verses like this in these chapters where it's all about Solomon getting credit for every detail of the design and construction of the temple. Now here's where it gets kind of interesting. In the middle of chapter 6, God finally shows up. So verses 1 through 10, it's all Solomon's doing this, and Solomon's building that, and Solomon's carving this, and Solomon's got this design and the other. Look at verse 11, 1 Kings 6:11. The word of the Lord came to Solomon. Okay, finally, God's getting involved. You'd be thinking this if you're hearing this in ancient Israel. God says, as for this temple you are building, if you follow my decrees, observe my laws, and keep all my commands and obey them, I will fulfill through you the promise I gave to your father David. And I will live among the Israelites and will not abandon my people Israel. This is interesting. Solomon's busy doing all these detailed designs and construction of the temple, and when God finally speaks up, notice, he doesn't say anything about the temple. He doesn't give any instructions about designing it, constructing, none of that. He just says, Solomon, hey, Solomon, can I have your attention for a minute? Like, you can almost imagine Solomon sitting there with a construction hat on, looking at the blueprints, directing everybody what to do, and God comes and taps him on the shoulder and says, can I interrupt for a second? Solomon, this whole thing you're doing, this temple, which I did not ask you for, hey, remember, what I really care about is that you obey me. What I really care about is not this building. What I really care about is, are you faithful to me? If you remain faithful to me, then we're good. I will dwell with you, I will dwell with my people. But don't get distracted by this construction project of yours. Okay, that's all I had to say. And how does Solomon respond? So Solomon built the temple and completed it. He doesn't respond to that. He doesn't give any attention to the warning that God just gave him. He lined the interior walls with cedar boards and paneling from floor, and he goes on and on and on and on with the construction project. It goes on for 23 more verses of details about the construction project. God is warning Solomon that you're giving your attention to the wrong priority. What you care about is not what I care about. You think I'm going to be impressed with an amazing temple. I am more than happy living in this tent. Thank you very much. Here's my point. Sometimes we want to do things, quote unquote, for God, when, if we're truly honest, we're really doing it for us. There was a study that was done some years ago about what products Americans buy based on how rich they are. So super poor, middle class, upper middle class, rich, and then like filthy rich. There were two examples that stood out to me. One was, this is back in the days when people still subscribed to magazines. They found that the poorest Americans, the magazines they read were like the Inquirer, right? The tabloid stuff at the checkout line at the grocery store. And then a level up from that was like People magazine. And then middle class folks, it was Newsweek or Time. And then the upper class, wealthy people, it was the Wall Street Journal or maybe the New York Times or something. And then the super hyper filthy rich people at the very top, you know what they read? The Inquirer. And the tabloid junk, right? And then they did this looking at car brands. Lower class people don't have a lot of money, you buy some old Ford, some old Chevy, whatever. Then you go up kind of middle class, you drive a Honda, a Buick, whatever. Kind of upper class professional people, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Lexus. Really rich, like super rich people, Ferrari, Rolls-Royce. And then you get the crazy, obnoxiously, like generationally wealthy people. They don't care what they drive. They're driving, it just doesn't, they're so stinking rich, they don't have to show it. So they're fine driving some jalopy. What's my point? If you're really secure, the truly secure person does not care what other people think about you. In John 13, it's the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet in the upper room. It starts out by talking about how Jesus, knowing that he had come from the Father and he was returning to the Father, and that all things had been given to him, removed his clothing, put a towel around his waist, and began washing his disciples' feet. What's the text saying? Jesus is so secure in his identity, knowing who he is, that he was perfectly comfortable humiliating himself, taking the lowest role of a servant. And he gets to Peter, and Peter sees this and is like, you are not washing my feet. Why? Because that's his rabbi. That's his master. If my master is washing people's feet and I'm lower than him, what does that make me? The reason Peter doesn't want Jesus washing his feet is because it was humiliating to Peter. Here's my point. Sometimes we want to do extraordinary things for God, and he's saying to us, I don't need you to do anything extraordinary for me because I'm not insecure. You are. You want to do something spectacular. You want the huge church. You want to transform the culture because you will feel significant and important. You will be like Solomon and look at the temple I built. And Jesus is perfectly content washing feet, being ridiculed, being humiliated, being mocked as he hangs on the cross. He came into the world to be despised. It's we who can't handle it. Sometimes our grandiose desires for God are really a way of masking our own insecurities. What David and Solomon were doing by building a temple for God in Jerusalem appears to be honoring God. That's not what was really going on. What they were actually doing was solidifying their own power. Think about it. If the presence of God resides in a mobile tabernacle, then it could move. The presence of God could go somewhere else. Another king could arise. Another tribe could have God's favor. Remember, the land of Israel was divided into 12 regions based on the 12 tribes. David was from the tribe of Judah. Jerusalem is in that territory. And their thinking is the only way we can ensure that God is always on the side of our family is we're going to make sure that his permanent residence cannot move. It's going to be where Judah is. It's going to be in Jerusalem. This is Solomon and David solidifying their hold on power over Israel by making God's temple a permanent location. It's not about primarily honoring God. It's about solidifying their power. And God's warning them, this ain't my project. I didn't ask for it. I'm not behind it. I'm not building it. I'm not completing it. Watch out, because you're on thin ice. And this is where it gets really dark. In 1 Kings chapter 5, we discover who it is that actually did the labor of constructing Solomon's temple. Remember Exodus, how was the tabernacle built? With materials that the people voluntarily donated, and it was constructed by people who were filled with the Spirit of God and volunteered to build the tabernacle. Solomon's temple, 1 Kings 5, verses 13 to 18. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. What are conscripted laborers? Slaves. Solomon went throughout Israel and kidnapped his own people, brought them to Jerusalem, and forced them to build the temple. He enslaved God's own people. When was the last time God's people were enslaved? Egypt. What is the writer saying about Solomon? He doesn't look like Moses. He looks like Pharaoh. "30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month. So they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Lebanon is where they got the timber and the raw materials for the temple. Solomon was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills, as well as 3,300 foremen who supervised the project and directed the workers. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Bablos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. And by the way, the materials were not voluntarily given. The fine gold and things were forcibly taken. This temple was not built in a way that honored the character of the God of Israel. As we wrap up, we learned something kind of perplexing. Let me give you one last thing to chew on. Given all that I just covered about this temple and how it was done, why it was done, the slavery, Solomon's arrogance, we would expect at the end, when it's finally done, that God would look at this and just go, I'm out. It's not for me. But in 1 Kings chapter 8, after a 7-day ceremony, by the way, to inaugurate the temple, 1 Kings 8, verses 10 and 11 says, when the temple was finished, the cloud filled the temple of Yahweh, for the glory of Yahweh filled his temple. God still showed up. Why? Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not cast out demons? Did we not do many mighty works? Sometimes God chooses in his sovereignty to use things and people despite their sin and disobedience. For whatever reason, God decided, all right, Solomon, I've warned you, I'll show up. I will let my presence be in this temple that you've built for me. But it's not an endorsement of what Solomon did. God shows up in spite of what Solomon did. And then in chapter 9, God speaks to Solomon after the dedication of the temple. Verse 1, when Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and had achieved all that he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. All right, let me pause. These are verses that even contemporary Christians love to cite. And we'll get into this Thursday and Friday. But people love to cite those verses as evidence that God has chosen the temple in Jerusalem as his permanent residence. He says it right here. My name, my eyes, my heart will always be there. The problem is, there are more verses after this that people don't often read. As for you, I want you to pay attention to the word if. If you walk before me faithfully, with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will become a byword and an object of ridicule among the peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this people? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. This whole story of the construction of Solomon's temple is one warning after another. I didn't ask for this, God says. I don't need this. I don't want this. The way you've done it dishonors me. Even in the middle of constructing at Solomon, I tapped you on the shoulder and said, hey, what I care about is obedience and allegiance, not the building. He ignored, he kept doing it. He's enslaved his own people. And even at the end, God says, all right, I'm gonna give you another chance. I will come, my presence will be here. I will consecrate this place with my name. I will even promise to stay here forever if you do what's right. But if you don't, this temple will be destroyed. You will be kicked out of the land, and everyone around the world will look and ask, what on earth happened to those pathetic people? This promise of God to reside at Solomon's temple is conditional. It is not permanent. Okay. What's the application for us? Did you guys ever watch or listen to the podcast that CT put out back in 2001, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill? Anyone familiar with that? Mars Hill is a mega church in Seattle led by a pastor named Mark Driscoll. It's about my age. It was a real hot commodity in the 2000s. The podcast is about the rise and fall of this megachurch. And one of the things that Driscoll famously said at a ministry conference, I have it written here, let me find it. He said, here it is, describing the building of this very influential megachurch. This is a quote. He says, there is a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus. And by the grace of God, it will be a mountain by the time we're done. You either get on the bus or you get run over by the bus. Those are the two options. In other words, Driscoll had this idea that we are building this megachurch and it's going to change the world for God. And you are either with us and helping us build this giant church, or the bus is going to run over you And he said, by God's grace, there will be a pile of bodies behind the bus by the time we're done. When we make our goals and ministry and mission for God more important than honoring God's images around us, we fall into that trap. We fall into the trap of Solomon. Think about it. We talked about this on Monday and Tuesday. The image of God in his temple is us. It's his people. And yet Solomon enslaved God's people to build a temple for God. How screwed up is that? Likewise, there are ministries that view people not as God's image bearers to be honored, but as human resources to be used to advance God's mission. People exist to contribute money to build the church, to expand our ministries, to do more work for God. It is not the church or its leaders who build God's kingdom. God can build his temple on his own perfectly fine without you. Be cautious of grandiosity. Be cautious of Christian leaders who have grandiose visions of what they are going to do for God. Could it be real? Yes. Could it be their own insecurity? Yes. Is it really God asking them to do something that he couldn't do without them? Probably not. But if there are bodies behind the bus, if there's dehumanization going on to advance the work of the gospel, God is not in it. And even if he chooses in his sovereignty to use it to accomplish good things, just as God in his sovereignty chose to allow his presence to reside at Solomon's temple, that alone is not an endorsement of the leaders or their values. God often, regularly, thank goodness every day, chooses to act in spite of us and not because of us. Okay, we have a minute and a half. Any final questions? And I'm probably not going to stick around afterwards, so speak now or forever hold your peace. Yeah. Can't hear you. It's a great question. Yeah, remember David said he wanted to build a temple, a house for God, and God says to David, no, your son, your descendant will be the one to build my house. There's two ways to understand that. There's the very genetic, human, fleshly way of understanding that David's literal son Solomon builds a house where God dwells and his name resides. Or you can take it as a messianic prophecy. The descendant of David, the son of David, Jesus, is the one who builds a permanent temple where God dwells, which is what we'll talk about tomorrow. So, both? One, the other? Yeah.
Similar passage in First Chronicles. David says, the Lord told me, Solomon is the one I've chosen to build the temple. And then David then even goes on to give Solomon the dimensions of the temple. I mean, was this Solomon's idea or was this God's idea?
That's a great mystery. I mean, obviously God chooses to dwell there. So here's what it reminds me of. When the Israelites demand a king, remember they had no king. It was not God's idea to give them a king, but they looked at all the nations around them and they said, we want a king. And they go to Samuel and they say, give us a king, and they choose Saul. And God says to Samuel, hey, just so you know, all right, I'll put my spirit on this king that they're asking for, but what they're actually doing is rejecting me, God says. By choosing, I'm their king. And they want a human king to be like, does God use the kings? Yes. It's part of his sovereign plan that ultimately the Messiah would be the descendant of King David. But is it God's plan to initially have a king? No, he sees it as a rejection of himself. Similarly, he would have been content in a tabernacle. They build a temple and he goes, okay, all right, I'll acquiesce. I will accommodate to what they want. We'll go with the temple plan. So was it God's plan from the beginning? Maybe. But it's ambiguous in the scriptures, just like it's ambiguous whether it was God's plan to have a kingdom. Yahweh was to be the king, not Saul. And it appears to be God's plan that Israel was never to have a king. But then you read it backwards and you go, oh, but he uses that. Does that make sense? It's a strange, convoluted, messy reality. Yeah.
I always thought the dedication prayer would indicate some level of understanding and commitment to the covenant that's already been made. And even, like he says things like, when we've been defeated by our enemies because we've been unfaithful to you, show us mercy. So I feel like it's kind of more real maybe because he's complicated. Maybe
Yeah, I mean, Solomon is a really complicated character. And here's what we didn't get into. What happens after the completion of the temple? And what happens after Solomon's reign? The kingdom splits in half. Because the northern kingdom, which is where Solomon enslaved most of the people to build the temple, would you want to worship God at a temple that you and your neighbors and family were enslaved to build? Like, screw you, Solomon. We're not going to be part of your kingdom. You enslaved us to build this God's temple. So the northern kingdoms say, forget you, Solomon. They break away. They create a new temple, a new place to worship God. Israel is never the same after this. The building of the temple is what irrevocably breaks Israel in half, never to be reunited. Solomon destroys the kingdom that David, his father, had built because of this project of the temple. It's a little bit like the Protestant Reformation. You know what triggered the Protestant Reformation is when the Pope in Rome wanted to expand St. Peter's. It was a building project. You guys ever been part of a church that divided over a building project? They wanted to expand St. Peter's, so they started selling indulgences throughout Northern Europe to raise money to build a bigger palace for the Pope. And Martin Luther and these others up in Germany are like, what the heck? We're not doing this. And the church splits. Building projects are very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. So when you look at the fruit of Solomon's work on this temple, it divides Israel. God's ambivalent at best about this temple. He says, all right, I'll abide there, but this wasn't my plan. The way you did it is not consistent with my character. The writing of these chapters, as I said, draws directly from the Exodus story, but takes God out of the whole process and makes Solomon the center of it. It's very clear that what the writers are saying is this is a human project that God grits his teeth at and says, fine, but he's not happy about it. And the fallout is catastrophic. So, all right, thank you. We'll be back tomorrow, and we'll look at exile and Jesus.
Does the vision of the temple fit in your strategy?
Yes.
Maybe